Hello, and welcome back to another episode of C-Suite Unplugged. I'm your host, Adam Legg, and in this series, I talk to Alberta's top CEOs, entrepreneurs, and business leaders about their journey to the C-Suite, what keeps them up at night, their perspective as a leader in their industry, and their outlook on the future. If you find this episode interesting or insightful, let us know by heading over to Apple Podcasts or Spotify and leaving us a quick review and rating. Now, on to the show. Well, welcome back to another C-Suite Unplugged podcast. And today, I really can't think of a more through and through Alberta leader than our guest on the podcast. He's born and raised in Alberta, has deep roots here. He has a background in banking and agriculture. He advises companies on how to make projects a reality here in Alberta. And oh yeah, he served as Alberta's Minister of Agriculture, Advanced Education Technology, Finance, and Deputy Premier. Doug Horner is a true guide and advisor to me and the team here at BCA, and is truly a remarkable member. Doug, thanks for joining us on the podcast.
Well, Adam, thank you very much for that very warm and generous introduction. I appreciate that. It's great to be here.
Doug, we start our podcast with a little bit of a get to know our CEOs, and then we talk about some of the more business related issues. But with a storied career as impressive as yours, I can't imagine there are many people who don't know you. But for our listeners who haven't stumbled across the Horner name in Alberta politics, can you give us a sense of who you are, what your background is, and P3 Capital Partners and the role you play there?
You know, I started out as an entrepreneur. Coming out of my banking career, as you mentioned, I started out with the Royal Bank and the Alberta Treasury branches, and was fortunate enough to be posted all across the province. I worked in Cochrane and Consort, Slave Lake, and it gave me a real appreciation for what business can do for the individual, for the community, and for my future. And I left the banking industry because my father and another brother had decided that we wanted to get into the value-added agricultural business. We started a oat and barley processing facility in northern Alberta, one of the first of its kind at the time, and built that into something that was then purchased by ConAgra International. They moved me to Omaha, Nebraska. I became the director of international sales for specialty grains for them. And then I decided that, you know, when I moved back to Alberta, that Ralph Klein's government wasn't doing the right things. And I went in and complained to my local MLA, Ken Kowalski, who told me, well, if you're going to complain, you got to do what your dad did, and let's get in there and do something about it. So I thought, yeah, what the heck, I'm going to do that. Got into politics in 2001, was elected MLA, was minister under Ralph Klein in 2004. I was Minister of Agriculture, Food and Rural Development during the BSE days, which, you know, you mentioned at the opening that finance was one of my tougher ones. I'd have to say that BSE was a struggle as a brand new ag minister.
Mm-hmm.
But finance was also a struggle because we had, as you recall, and your listeners will recall, the bitumen bubble.
Yep.
And that was problematic for Alberta and the economy. Did 15 years in a very, I think, rewarding career as deputy premier a number of times and other cabinet posts. But P3 Capital Partners came out of a need, I think, in the industry where corporate speak doesn't necessarily match up to government speak.
Mm-hmm.
And so our group, which is a former cabinet minister, a recovering politician like me, Jeff Johnson, myself, and Monica Barclay, who understands the bureaucratic side, we developed this group: government relations, advocacy, policy and business advisory, business development, and partner facilitation is what P3 Capital Partners does. And we've been going for about 5 years and frankly, quite busy right now. So lots going on. And that's kind of where my career ended. I mean, a serial entrepreneur, but politician for a portion of that career.
Just to make things interesting and in between private sector. And you the last time we got together, you had said that the next chapter for Doug Horner is ranching. So we'll look forward to that.
Yeah, it's not really ranching. It's more like hobby ranching. But yeah.
That's okay. No one needs to know whether it's a hobby or not. It's still ranching, right? Doug, when you finished high school, the whole world was in front of you. What were some of the things that you were thinking about as you then built your path, as you say, into banking and agriculture and entrepreneurship? What really drove you in those directions?
You know, I left high school and I was working on the pipelines. Actually, I was a pipeliner. I was doing a pipeline out by Caroline, Alberta. And I was standing in the middle of a field at about minus 35 with a tiger torch in my hand, melting a sleeve on a pipe and thinking, I think I want to do something different than this with my career. And that's when I decided I'd go into post-secondary and got a diploma in business administration. Was very keen on the marketing side of business and the sales side of business. which has kind of been my career ever since, is in the marketing and the finance piece. Left SAIT in Calgary in 1982. 1982, as a lot of people will recall, was a pretty tough time in Alberta's economic history. We had very, very high interest rates. We had a lot of jobs and businesses folding. And frankly, banks were the only ones hiring for business grads at the time. And that's how I ended up being a banker. So went into banking. But as I said earlier, that was the genesis of me getting the idea that I could run my own business. I could be the keeper of my own P&L and the keeper of my own balance sheet. And so that's why I went into business for myself. And since that point, other than my government stint, I've always worked for companies that I founded.
Yeah, interesting. Interesting. What was it like, Doug, to make that switch from private sector entrepreneurship into politics? I'd be curious about that one, and then coming back out of politics and back into entrepreneurship. How did Doug reinvent himself?
I probably said all the same things that I've heard numerous other guys say when somebody asks them if they want to get into politics. My first answer is, well, I don't know if I could do that. I'm too much of a get it done kind of guy, and I say what I think, and I do what I say, and I'm pretty about what I think, and everybody says that, and you go into that thinking that that's what you're going to do and you're going to change the world, and in fact you can. There's no question about that. You have to temper it just like you do in business. I mean, I've heard a lot of business people say the same thing, but when you get into a meeting with them and into a room full of their clients or their customers, they will guard what they say. They will talk about their product. They'll talk about what they're going to do. They'll talk about their business plans. The government is no different. Politics is different. Being an MLA is different because you have now something in the range of 52,000 clients that expect you to be on 24/7. And I would say that's probably one of the biggest things that I think new MLAs or new elected officials struggle with is the fact that you are never not the MLA. You are never not the councillor. You are never not the member of parliament. And you have to get over that piece fairly quickly or you'll be a one-termer. So that transition, the other piece that is interesting that I don't think a lot of people would understand is that this is a job where you can do extremely well. You can succeed in all of the objectives that are given to you, and you can still get fired every 4 years. So that is always in the back of your mind, and that's where politics becomes a bigger part of the job, if you will, because you need to be able to listen and you need to be able to separate the wheat from the chaff. It's not always about listening to the loudest. The other thing I would say that's different is the decision process in government is totally different than it is in a corporate setting. And if you don't understand that from the corporate side, it's very difficult to understand why governments and ministries and premiers, frankly, do what they do, because you wouldn't do that in business. You would do something different. And that's one of the jobs that we have in P3 Capital Partners is we try to help businesses, not-for-profits, ABCs, understand the why of what a decision might be made or how it might be made in government. Remember, even today, you have a committee, if you will, of caucus of 49 some odd individuals who are all, earned their spot to be in that chair in their own right. They have a right to have a say in the decisions that even you as a minister make. So you've got a lot of guys, big committees you've got to talk to. And then there's a whole process that is a government process you got to get through. So those would be the biggest frustrating type of differences that I saw coming from being, the leader of your destiny and your own business and working with a small group with an objective that is very focused and defined, to government where you are working on issues that you would never have thought of before. And you frankly have to learn fast. You got to get up to speed very, very quickly. And sometimes you know what you want to do, but it takes a very long time to get that decision out into the open and actioned on.
Yeah, I look at the ambitions of policy platforms and election platforms of what gets done, and it is huge machines. They have to go through both from your fellow caucus and cabinet, but then into the public service and get those decisions built
and
through.
Many times it comes back over and over again too. I had the curse or the blessing of sitting in a number of different caucuses over the 15 years, and it was interesting to see issues that would be voted down in one caucus come back 4 or 5 years later in another caucus and get voted down all over again because everybody thought it was a great idea, and it actually isn't once you get into the details of it. So there's lots of that sort of stuff that happens too.
What are some of those things about being a minister, Doug, that people may not know? I'm sure they think it's a glamorous role and what have you, but maybe what were some of your favorite things about it, and what were some of your biggest struggles as a minister?
Well, the favorite thing for me was the people that I worked with and the teams that I had, and bar none, that was it. I was very fortunate in the ministries that I had and the people that I led. I had 5 different premiers that I served over that period of time in various different cabinets and treasury boards and agendas and priorities committees. But I think from the perspective of what is a surprise is the time. It's the amount of time that they actually put into that job. I don't think people realize that you're elected as the MLA. In today's world, that's a full-time job to be the MLA. You're then given additional duties as the MLA with regard to the committees in the legislature or standing policy committees in the government. Much of that work does not go away when you become a cabinet minister, but now you're the CEO of what could be a $25 billion organization
Mm-hmm.
that you are evidently going to lead. And so that's one thing. So you're essentially 15 hours a day at a minimum, more than likely 6 to 7 days a week.
Mm-hmm.
And then because then you add on the other part of your job, which is the politics side.
Yeah.
As a cabinet minister, you're also required in a lot of the caucuses that I was in to be at certain events to represent the government or to represent the party or to represent, your constituency. So you add all of those things together and it becomes a scheduling nightmare. And a lot of people think, oh, I can't get a hold of the minister. I can't get a hold of I can't get a meeting. You got to think about all of the things that are on that plate. It's not just that he's a cabinet minister. He's a politician and he's a member of a party that has to support that and raise money and do all those good things. He's also the MLA for the area, and he's going to have to be in his constituency as much as possible, because if he isn't, then he's not elected again. I door knocked in the off seasons just as much as I door knocked in campaigns, because people need to see their MLAs. And I've often told new or want to be MLAs, just remember the job you're actually running for is to be the MLA. So you're the MLA first.
Mm-hmm.
If you're lucky enough and blessed enough to make it into cabinet, that's wonderful, because it is a very interesting role. You are at the table, as they say. You're seeing what no one else sees. You are one of, when I was elected, I was one of 714 individuals who had been lucky enough to be elected into the legislature of Alberta in its history.
Mm-hmm.
And then I was one of an even fewer group to become a member of executive council, and then an even fewer group to become deputy premier. So a lot of those things are very fortunate, but they're very honorable in my mind. And you can do some very interesting things. You meet a lot of very interesting people.
Yeah. Yeah, it's quite a task when you layer all of that on top. Doug, from a leadership standpoint, just a quick story before I get to the question. And I think you and I have chatted about this before, but when I was running the Calgary Chamber and you were Minister of Finance, you came in and did what I think is probably the most memorable meeting as a minister, bar none, for me in my career. And it was a pre-budget consultation, and you took your jacket off, you rolled up your sleeves and said, folks, I've got a couple ideas I'm batting around. You literally went up to the whiteboard and you sketched it out. And it was so memorable because most of the ministers I've ever met with are not willing to get up to the whiteboard and sketch out an idea. So like, tremendous acknowledgement to you for that. And B, just being a human and engaging with the people for their thoughts and ideas. And I never saw it before and I've never seen it since. And I think it speaks to you and your character and your leadership of just truly wanting to connect with people at that personal level and be willing to throw some ideas out and have them batted around, torn apart, feedback given. And that spoke to a lot of your integrity and how you wanted to engage with business from that perspective, the business community. And it speaks a lot of your leadership. As I say, I've never saw it before, never seen it since. What is your leadership philosophy? What kind of leader do you want to be remembered as? Because I'll say you left an imprint on me as a leader that day.
Well, then that's the kind of leader I want to be. And I was thinking about that not too long ago when someone else was asking me about what I would call my leadership style. And I like to think it was fostering talent. I like to think that it was making sure that the people around me were smarter than I was. I would hazard a guess they all were. but to give them the rein that they needed to get us to the objective. One of the things that one could argue the military taught me or my dad taught me was that if you have an objective, it's plot where you're going to get to, how you're going to get there, what the obstacles will be in the way, and who do you need to help you to go through down that path. And always remember that you won't make that path if you don't have, and you have to give them the credit that they deserve and the credit that they're due.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the stuff that I put up on that whiteboard, my team went through with me before I did that.
Mm-hmm.
And just like you would do a sales pitch, just like you would do a business presentation, I want to be able to get the feedback to know that what we're putting up there, if it doesn't have consensus, it's the right thing to do. And if it's the right thing to do, people will follow, people will go there. So for me, it's fostering talent, it's getting people to be leaders and go beyond me, go beyond what their dream is. That's what I want them to do. So, if I did that with my staff, if I did that for you, I'm extremely blessed to be able to do that. I love it when former staff members come up to me and this is no slight to any of the ministers that are there today or been, but when somebody comes up and says, you were the best minister I ever had, or you were my first minister, and God, I wish you were back in, that's very rewarding to hear that coming from some folks. And that tells me, okay, I did some things right.
Well, I would say you've done many things right, Doug. Absolutely.
Appreciate that.
Doug, what advice would you have for someone starting their career that may want to follow in your footsteps, either in entrepreneurship or in government? What would you encourage them to do or even not do?
Well, from an entrepreneurial perspective, it's patience, it's persistence, and it's perseverance, but it's also knowing when to quit. And I'm as guilty of this as anybody, right? You get an idea for a business opportunity and something you think is just the best thing since sliced bread, and you run it to the ground, and it runs you into the ground. At some point in time, a friend or a colleague or a mentor comes to you and puts your hand on your shoulder and goes, Doug, this one ain't gonna fly, so maybe you should move on to something else. So yes, you got to have persistence, but you also got to have an understanding of when it's time to throw in the towel. But that's the last resort in my mind, the very, very last resort. My dad always used to tell me there's no such word as can't. You just make it happen, right? And I would say, from advice I would give to someone who wants to get into politics, the first thing is make sure your family's solid. This is a job that is very, very hard on families, like very hard. Personal experience and lots of it. I think the other thing you have to do is you got to have a really, really tough skin, and you got to make sure that your family have tough skin, especially today. Not wasn't as bad in my dad's day or even his dad's day, but these days with the social media and everything going on, protecting your family from, I would say, the empowered people that never had a platform before, who now have a platform to be as nasty as they want to be, is something that politicians of today need to gird themselves for, because it's pretty ugly in certain spots. That's not to say that it's not a rewarding, very positive career. It is. It's not very rewarding from a financial perspective. So they better go in there knowing that. People all think, oh, you got a pension. Nah, there's no pension. There's no severance, and there's the salary's kind of, eh. The other thing I would say is be open to ideas. Don't be locked into an ideology or a belief. The fact of the matter is, as an MLA, you're representing everybody in that constituency. So you can't be locked into an ideology. And you have to, who you are is going to guide what you do and how you vote and how you do things. People need to understand that. But don't be locked into just listening to one echo chamber. And one of the things that I mentioned to colleagues and family that want to get into politics, because there's been more than one, is that you don't just listen to the loudest voice in the room. In fact, what you want to do is go and ask the people who are quiet what they think, because you're going to get a better cross section of the people in that room. And when Ralph Klein used to work a room, that's exactly what he did. He went and talked to the guys that were the loudest, for sure. But he also went and talked to the people that were just sitting there with their arms crossed and asking them, what do they think? So you've got to be able to do that. You've got to be able to, speak. We were talking a little earlier about public speaking. You're going to get baptism by fire on that. You have to be able to learn fast and on your feet. And these are all things that a lot of guys will trip over. And the other piece of advice I usually give them is something that Ken Kowalski gave me, which was, more people have talked themselves out of the legislature than in. So be careful what you say.
That's great encompassing advice there, Doug. Thank you. Let's switch gears to P3 Capital Partners. tell us a bit more about it, the different types of services you provide, and if someone comes to you with a project or an idea, how do you help them?
Well, a lot of times it's just been word of mouth where people, if you're talking about, we do it kind of in three buckets. We do government relations and advocacy, so we will register as a lobbyist because you have to do that and follow that process and protocols. And we have no problem with that. We also do advice around policy and some of the business advisory stuff. So some of the work that we do has nothing to do with government. It's simply about, strategy, tactics, and business advisory. But on the policy piece, a lot of people think, well, why doesn't the government do this? Why wouldn't they we did a project where we did the wireless light switches. It makes a lot of sense. Why are they doing it? Well, because you got to ask in the right way and go down the right path. Business development, between Jeff, Monica, and I, we've developed quite a, I don't know if people still use the term Rolodex, but quite a network of individuals and groups. So we can find partners for various ventures and capitals. Like the Beaver Lodge Hospital replacement is probably a P4 because you have a philanthropic piece, you have a public and private partners involved. So we bring these different pieces together. The government relations piece, the thing that we bring to the table that a lot of others don't, is the fact that, we were the guys sitting across the table for a long time. We got lobbied by a lot of people. We kind of understand what works, what doesn't work. But more importantly, we also understand how that process works in government. And my view has always been, let's go find out who the people are that are going to say no. Let's get what the objection is first, because everybody knows who says yes. It's either the minister, the premier, the treasury board, whatever it is. So it's easy to find. What we don't know is who in that huge monolith of government is going to be the people that are going to say no to your idea, your process, your product, your whatever it is you're trying to do. And if you don't get rid of those no's first, you're going to have a long haul on your hands. And so we kind of do a lot of that sort of stuff. That's what P3 Capital Partners does. We've been at it for 4 or 5 years now, and we've had some modicum of success, I like to think. So yeah.
That's great. What are you seeing as the interest in Alberta here, Doug? I'm not asking for specifics on your clients, but broadly speaking, thematically around industries or types of projects, what are people seeing as the potential and the opportunity for investment in Alberta?
Well, potential investment in Alberta, obviously, we had at one point the highest amount of renewable investment in the country. And I think people need to understand that Alberta is a leader in renewable energy, but we're also a leader in renewable energy and energy technology. When you talk about AI, when you talk about transformative technology that crosses all of the sectors, whether you're talking about value-added agriculture, whether you're talking about primary production of agriculture, if you're talking about transmission of electricity, we are leaders in that group. When you're talking about things like medical technologies, the devices that are produced at the University of Calgary are second to none in the world. When you're talking about the immunology labs in Edmonton and the Likashing Institute for Virology that is developing stuff that is mind-blowing. You have a Nobel Prize winner at the University of Alberta in virology that is second to none. So there's a lot of really positive things that we could talk about in Alberta and to attract investment. Fundamentally, we are food, water, energy, medical technology, AI. Those are the things that are driving people to our province. Where we're seeing a lot of interest is in affordable housing. Obviously, you've got significant growth of the economy in Alberta. You've got significant people moving into Alberta. So there's a lot of capital pressures and infrastructure pressures. And we're seeing a lot of requests coming to us to say, okay, so how do we deal with these pressures without actually just going to the government and asking for a big pot of money? And that's the kind of stuff that we're seeing.
Mm-hmm. Are there any consistent themes, Doug, in terms of any of the challenges of getting projects on the ground here in Alberta in terms of either capital or regulation or what have you?
Well, you just took two.
Okay, well, there you go.
I would, it's interesting, and we talk about this at the council too. We've had these conversations about people, and people is the one thing that I hear quite often, that you can't get enough people, whether you're in the hospitality sector or you're in the energy sector or you're in any of these other sectors, is finding, and it isn't so much just finding a body, it's finding the right people, right? And you've got, and I think it was one of the things that you had done relative to matching the skill sets with the job vacancies. We're having a tough time with that. And our post-secondaries need to listen to some good advice on that. I think our federal government needs to understand where international students and work permits are revoked. That actually causes more of a problem for us. So we need to understand some of the implications and the consequences of those kinds of decisions. So I would say people is the number one. Capital, a friend of mine who's a partner in Canada Asia Synergy Group used to tell us capital will find good projects. So find a good project and a good business opportunity, and it'll find capital. So I'm not as worried about the capital side. And when you talk about the capital I'm speaking about, it's not about the innovative capital. It's not about the startup capital. That is always going to be a problem and always going to be an issue, which lots of people have addressed. But I think that's probably the two things that the people, skill sets, and matching that is probably the number one thing we're hearing.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what we hear quite a bit from our members and beyond as well. Yeah. You mentioned Canada Asia Synergy Group. Doug, you serve as chair of that. Share with us a little bit about what that group does and your interest in Canada and Asia, how that interest originated.
Well, the interest originated when I was the agriculture minister, and we had the issue of closed borders to beef. And my tasking from Premier Klein at the time was to go and find new markets for beef. So we, kind of, as I used to do in my international trade, because that was my skill set before, was hop on a plane, go talk to people in the market that we want to get into, which at that time happened to be China. And it was my very first trip to China, because my market internationally when I was doing my businesses for the mill was Central and South America and Europe. And so when I got off the plane, I had a preconceived notion in my head what China was going to be like. It was probably developed by watching TV and bad movies. And I got off the plane and I was walking into the biggest air terminal that I'd ever seen in my life, the most modern infrastructure that I'd ever seen in my life. And one of the other things that hit me was a young lady that was tasked with helping us out and doing some translating and stuff. And she had a Starbucks mug in her hand. And I thought, well, that's interesting. She's buying Starbucks. And I asked somebody, I said, well, what's the average wage for these people? Blah, blah, blah. Her wage would not allow her to buy that Starbucks in my mind on a regular basis, but she had that cup in her hand every day. And I asked her one day, I said, where do you get your Starbucks from? She said, no, I just bought the Starbucks once. I refill it with coffee from home because I want people to think I bought it from Starbucks.
Oh, that's funny.
And I thought that to me tells me that that's a population that's very material in what they do, and they want higher end value added things. So why are we not servicing at that time the largest market outside of the United States on the planet? And so when I left politics, my partner Monica Barkley had been started up the China Institute at the University of Alberta. So very knowledgeable about China, very knowledgeable and well connected over there. So we thought, let's find 9 other partners who are experts in their field. Let's bring them together and let's see if we can do some business to business matching between Canadian businesses, not necessarily just Alberta, but Canadian businesses and businesses in China. So we took something in the range of 30 companies over to China on an ongoing basis, introduced them to various connections that we had in Shanghai and many other places in China. And that's what we were doing right up until an arrest in Vancouver was made of a particular individual who caused another cascading series of events that put a relative chill on the relationships between Canada and China. And then COVID hit.
Yeah.
And so you couldn't go over there, you couldn't talk to people. And we kind of shelved the China side of things. We're looking at trying to do some work in India, but there again, we have an international situation that has caused a bit of problems in getting visas and travel and that sort of stuff. So it's kind of on hold right now, Adam, but the concept was great because you had lots of experience on this side, business connectivity on that side. That is our next market. I'm still convinced of that. If it's not China, it's India. If it's not India, it's Southeast Asia and that population base that's there.
Yeah, massive populations, all looking to achieve what we have here in terms of quality of life, middle class.
Exactly.
Yeah. Doug, you probably won't be surprised to know we wouldn't let you go without some questions on fiscal situation in Alberta, and few people understand it truly as well as you. What's your view of Alberta's fiscal position right now?
Alberta's financial situation is very strong. If you just look at the balance sheet and the P&L, if you were to look at it from a business perspective, we have a very strong balance sheet, one of the strongest in North America, I would say. We are still, from a net debt perspective, we're still very strong. We have lots of room, if you will. Unfortunately, a few years back, a lot of that room was used in a manner that I don't think was appropriate. In other words, you don't buy your groceries with your Visa if you can avoid it, and we were doing that. So getting rid of that debt, that operational debt, I think is critically important, and I'm pleased to see that the province is doing that. The Minister of Finance talked about debt repayment and he talked about savings. So, on a go forward basis, there are a lot of levers that are out there. People focus in on, what's the price of oil today? What's Texas? What's WCS? It's not just that. It's what's the price of gas? What's the price? What's the exchange rate that we're dealing with? Those two factors alone have as much or a bigger influence on what kind of revenue you're going to get than just the price of oil. Corporate tax, and you know this probably better than most as well from your economic analysis days. Corporate tax, personal tax, these are the canaries in the coal mine for us. As you start to see those things slide, you start to wonder where things are going, what's happening there. Our job numbers are slowly climbing back up. Our economy is growing probably faster than anywhere else in Canada. So from the perspective of the financial situation as we sit today, we're on a good path. We have surpluses projected for the next couple of years. They're small ones. That's precarious. You have regulatory or legislative taskings with any money that comes over from a surplus, which may tie the hands of some future finance ministers if they wanted to do some different things. And, I did the same thing. I passed legislation that said you couldn't borrow for operating and we had to be population plus inflation. Things happen and you have to be prepared for that. We had a $6 billion contingency fund. Minister Horner's put in, I think, a $2 billion contingency fund. Is that going to be enough? We'll see. The floods of 2013, the fires, the drought that is facing us in the next little while worry me a little bit. But frankly, if you were going to be the finance minister somewhere, this is a good place to be.
Yeah, it's one of the probably the best places in Canada to have that role. You alluded to some of the fiscal rules, and one of your subsequent successors, Travis Taves, introduced the fiscal framework aimed at putting some guardrails in place, so to speak. How does it compare to what you had in place, and how do you think this one is playing out and will likely pay out over the next few years?
I think it compares very favorably, and Travis and I had some really good discussions about that, and I applauded him for doing it. I applauded Nate for keeping it in and adding a few. If you don't have the rules, the finance minister has a very tough time saying no. And if you have the rules, you can point to those rules. You can point to the outcome of those rules, which is the benefit to the taxpayers of today and tomorrow. And that's the critical piece. It's one of the challenges that the finance minister has, is to be able to say no and give a good reason as to why he's saying no. And it's not just him that says no, by the way. He has treasury board, he has all that sort of stuff, but obviously he plays a major role in that. I think the idea that we talked about was Alberta's going to grow. Our service demand is going to grow because of that significant influx of people and kids and healthcare demand and all that sort of stuff. It's going to grow. So finding innovative ways to have other sectors pick up the slack is one of the key things that I think we need to really look further down the road. The kinds of partnerships and joint ventures that we're doing in our group are things that the government can facilitate that won't have as big a hit on their bottom line as just doing it themselves. That's one of the other things that I think that needs a lot more work, and we're seeing it now at AHS, and the dismantling of that is sometimes government doesn't do things as efficiently as business does. And I think that there's things that we can do in infrastructure that would also, like, why do we have to own everything? I don't understand. I didn't know that when I was finance minister. I still don't understand why we have to own everything. We can do things that are our prime delivery objective, but do we have to own the building that it's in? Because 30 years from now, we're just going to have to replace it if we don't do the maintenance and all that good stuff. So there's risks, but there's rewards, and I think Alberta's poised to have another really good run here for quite a while because we're in all of the sectors where there's going to be demand.
Doug, you touched on that notion of why do we have to own everything, and to me it speaks about a bit of a broader question of innovation in government and what stops innovation in government from happening. And obviously there's I hear lots of stories around elected officials have ideas and the public service doesn't really want to change what they're doing. And so I'll call it the immune system response kicks in and fights back against all this novelty and innovation. But from your
Yeah.
experience, what is it that people always look to government and think it's so slow and antiquated and outdated? What's holding us back from innovation in government?
Well, government is holding us back from innovation in government. You know, the process to make a decision or make a change is very, very laborious, and it takes a long time, and it's because of all those people that can say no. You have to remember, and I know you know this, but you have to remember that when you have a policy development, it starts somewhere in a department that with somebody going, well, this is an idea the minister wants to do, or this is an idea that I think is really good, or this is an idea that came to us from an outside sector, and we're going to do an analysis to see how we think it should go. Now, if we think it shouldn't go, now the whole process is about telling the minister why it shouldn't happen. And that goes all the way up the chain in a briefing note to the minister, so that when, you know, the person who wants to get this across the finish line sits down with the minister and gives him his pitch, the minister's already got a briefing note in front of him that tells him why he shouldn't do it. So how do you get over that? And that takes a lot of doing, that takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort to make sure that you're following that chain all the way up. I think that's one piece. The other piece, frankly, is there are people in the bureaucracy, and this is true of any bureaucracy, whether it's a government one or a corporate one, who like the way things are and they don't like change. And if you're going to tell them that they are no longer going to be managing a portfolio of $1 billion worth of infrastructure and buildings because you're going to get rid of it, they start to wonder what their job is. And guess what kind of briefing note that's going to be. So, you know, that's the kind of stuff that causes a lot of grief. It's also the stuff that has to be done incrementally. Too often, I think in government, what happens is you get elected, you're going to change the world, you come in there, you've got a great idea, it's good, and it is a good idea, it's wonderful, but it's going to necessitate a significant amount of change all the way through the bureaucracy. Well, if you're not prepared to stay the course for a long, long time, it's going to be really tough. It took 5 years, and you'll remember this, it took 5 years to get Campus Alberta across the line. And the only way that it got across the line was I happened to stay as the minister for those 5 years.
Yeah.
What happens in governments too is your leadership changes. You've got a brand new minister who likely has no experience in that portfolio. If you're lucky, they do. And they got a learning curve that takes 6 to 8 months. Then they've got an action period of time that might be 12 months. And then they're probably transferred out to somewhere else. And you'll have senior leadership in the departments that are doing the same thing. So partly that, and there's good things about that too, by the way, don't get me wrong, because you also get fresh ideas, you get new ideas, you get things that can happen. So out of that whole process, good things do trickle out, but it's a labyrinth of things that have to happen.
Yeah, that's tricky. Doug, another Horner, has the title of Minister of Finance and President of Treasury Board. Minister Nate Horner, carrying on the tradition of the Horner finance legacy. What advice did you have for him as he was entering the role?
Well, we refer to it as a genetic defect, but because I think he's fourth or fifth generation now, and he's the third agriculture minister, Horner. You know, the advice I had was to make sure that he keeps grounded, because we all have to do that, and thankfully he's very much so grounded in his family and his home and his roots. The advice I also gave him was he's got to listen to everybody. You don't make a decision based on just what you think. You base the decision on what good information you have coming from around you. I also suggested to him that all of the good advice isn't in-house. There's good advice outside too that you should listen to. And sometimes it's the right thing to listen to, even though your department might be telling you something else. The other thing I told him is he's not going to be a very popular guy, because he's going to have to say no to a lot of things that people hold very dear. You know, and thankfully he's got the kind of demeanor that makes that possible. I think he's doing a very good job with a difficult situation. His budget is balanced with a small surplus, but it does do a lot of things good for the province, sets the course for the growth that we're going to have. In terms of advice, you know, I was told just be you, because he's a solid individual who knows what he's doing.
Yeah.
He's
Yeah.
also a lot smarter than people give him credit for, I think.
But we're big fans of him. He's humble, he's a straight shooter, and I think he's steering us in the right directions. Last
Agreed.
question on the fiscal side, Doug, $1 million one for us here at the Business Council is, do you ever see a time when Alberta will examine its revenue model and implement something more stable?
Well, examine the revenue model. How many times do we do that? I did it.
Shift to
I
the
think
revenue model, I should
I think Ed did. I think Ralph did. You know, as I recall, the initial establishment of the Alberta Heritage Savings Trust Fund by Peter Lougheed was for that eventuality. And you remember in those days, they were talking about peak oil in like the 80s or something, or 90s, for that eventual reality where we didn't have that energy royalty flow of dollars coming in. And it's still a valid opportunity for us. We, during Ralph's time and then into Ed's time and beyond that, maybe a little bit into Getty's time, we've never drawn from the principle of the Alberta Heritage Savings Trust Fund. It was set up as a rainy day fund. And when I did my budget consultations, I said, okay, so when is the rainy day that you draw for the Heritage Savings Trust Fund? And the resounding answer was, well, never, you don't. So whatever you put in, it's there, it stays there. And that's an interesting thing to remember. The second piece is that what we used to earn from the Heritage Savings Trust Fund at one point roughly represented about a 2%, what would be a 2% sales tax. So the revenue you're generating from your savings was actually generating the offset of what the provincial sales tax would have been. That was kind of one of the other ideas that were around that. So if we can get to a point where that revenue from your Heritage Savings Trust Fund is at or exceeds the amount that you would nominally get if you went to an HST, well, why do you need to go to an HST? I think there's political risk, obviously, in Alberta for anybody to come out there and start talking about it. There's other places and other levers you can use. What I would caution on the model that we have is let's not shut down all the levers that we have. And that would be problematic because at some point in time, you are going to have to do something different. The entire time that I was elected, I don't think we raised personal income taxes once, the entire time. And you think about for a 15-year time span, how many times your property taxes went up, like every year. And so you very fortunate, we are very fortunate in Alberta to live in a place where that is the case. I think to examine the revenue question, the economists, no offense, will always say that a personal sales tax, provincial sales tax would be the right way to go. And I know some of our members in the BCA will argue that point too. But I would also argue that part of the reason Alberta is as successful as it is because we are known to be the lowest tax regime and we want to stay there. You know, we compare ourselves, or there's been these comparisons in the media and even in government about, we want to be like Norway. Well, just remember what Norway's sales tax is and what their base and their base income tax is. They are still paying for social services that are far beyond what their normal means would be, because they also draw from their savings, their sovereign wealth funds, whenever their budget deficit shows up. So there's pros and cons. I like the idea of building the Heritage Savings Trust Fund. We tried to do it too. We actually added some dollars into it. You just have to do it in a cautious manner. Do we need to reflect upon how our revenue stream is right now? I think right now is not a good time to do that. We can do that in the future if need be. I don't think we ever want to shut the door. And that's something that Albertans are going to have to understand, because on the one hand, you want your school and your healthcare and everything else. On the other hand, you got to pay for it somehow.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. We have to pay for it. Last question, Doug, as we wrap here, knowing you, knowing your heritage and your roots, I'm sure I know the answer. Your long-term view for Alberta. Are you excited? Are you concerned? Are we headed in the right direction? And what do we need to do to make sure we stay on the right path?
Obviously, I'm very, very excited about Alberta's future. I've got 5 grandkids that I think are going to have a fabulous future in this province and this country. I'm a strong Canadian. I've been blessed to be able to wear the uniform of our country. I would defend it and its future. I think, Alberta we have all of the things that we need. We have water, we have land, we have energy, we have technology, we have smart people. We've got great resources in tourism and movies, and the list goes on, and you've written about it. that there are so many great things happening in this province. We have a much more balanced economy than people think. Everybody goes, "Oh, you're oil and gas." Not so. We're leaders in so many different areas. Our problem is everybody focuses on one. And what we need to do is we need to start talking about that other stuff. And I think if we can get down that path and start talking about the fact that, we're number one in renewables, we're number one in agriculture and food value added, we're number one in nutraceuticals and biopharma. I mean, like I said, the list goes on and on that I could rattle on here for 20 minutes. Why are we not talking about that piece and moving down that path? And I would say the risks to that side, I would call it our youth, I'd call it our people. We need to make sure that we're supporting those who need the support to get into those skill sets that we need them to have so that we can continue to do what we do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well said, Doug. And that really parlays in the work we've done around Define the Decade and the future of the province across so many different really critical areas. We literally could compete and win globally in those areas you talked about. So
you pick one, we can do it. And little things like even like micro credentialing, all that sort of stuff that BCA came out. I just think there's no end of opportunity. It's focusing on the positive, not the negative, and moving forward.
Yeah. Well, Doug, this has been a fantastic and fascinating conversation. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for your leadership in Alberta, and really grateful for you joining the podcast. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. It's been fun. It's been a pleasure. We'll talk soon.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of C-Suite Unplugged, an Alberta Better podcast series. This podcast is a production of the Business Council of Alberta. You can learn more about us at businesscouncilab.com. We'd love to connect with you on social media, so give us a follow at BizCouncilAB, that's B-I-Z, Council AB, on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. If you like this episode and want to support our message of shared prosperity for all, please be sure to head over to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts to subscribe, rate the show, and give us a quick review. New episodes drop every other Tuesday. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.